So now that we've covered things such as immutability and mutability, we need to now dive into what we call imperative and declarative programming. Typically, things are imperative from the get-go. And by that I mean, previously in JavaScript, we would only write imperative style code. And then tools and frameworks and libraries evolve to give us a more declarative style because they tend to be easier done. The biggest thing is to understand the difference between imperative and declarative, we need to talk about what things are, not how they do them. Now, first off, I'm going to create a constant. We're going to call this the item names, and we're going to call this the imperative array. This would just be an empty array, and then what we'll do is use a good old-fashioned for loop to then iterate over our items array above. So we can say I is then less than items dot length, and then we want to go ahead and increment I, which means that this will keep executing until we reach the end of our array. If we were to grab each individual item, we then say items square bracket, and because we're incrementing I, this starts at 0, which gives us the first item. We increment it again, that gives us the second item. We increment it again, that gives us the third item, and then we can go ahead and say item names imperative, and what we're going to do is just push in our item. Below we say console log item names imperative. We can then save this out and we have an identical array. Now this type of operation is pretty common. The end result doesn't actually matter, it's the style of the code that we write. So this is called the imperative way, and what I want you to think about it as is a list of instructions. Now moving over to a declarative way, it's a new mental model for a developer to adopt. Now when we think of imperative code, I don't know about you, but when I first started learning JavaScript and saw this line of code, it deeply confused me. And that is because it's more of an operational model of our JavaScript program. We're not used to thinking in terms of variables and incrementing and these types of things. So this is where declarative programming has evolved and become important with functional programming, which is exactly why we're covering it today. So again, our imperative method simply describes how something is achieved. That is the real difference. When we achieve it, it doesn't matter. The arrays are the same. And that is, of course, declaring it as is versus creating a new array. And if we want to be precise, we'll add that item name in to give us the item names imperatively. So this is just one example of how we can adopt a new array from an existing one, which is something that we would do declaratively with array prototype.map. Now map describes what is happening, it doesn't mutate any state, and it's much more readable than what we have above, which are some of the benefits that we do get with declarative programming. You can think of declarative programming as more programming with our declarations via sentences rather than instructions to a machine, for example, our program. So if we create a new constant, we're going to say item names, and then we're going to say declarative. We can then say items.map. We can then pass in a callback function to access each item, and you can see that already we're not instructing how to obtain individual items. This is exactly what we're doing in this scenario. Not only are we stepping through the indexes of our array and then manually incrementing them, we're also having to calculate how to access each individual item by using this variable that exists in our for loop. We don't have to do any of that with declarative, it just does it, and that's the great thing about it. So I'm promoting that we use this declarative new approach, which comes in very handy with our functional style. And while we're here, we might as well say that things like .map, .filter, .reduce, these are actually more of a functional style that's brought to JavaScript. Now the way that we can get the names is simply by returning item.name. We can then grab our variable, replace our console log, and in the browser console we then see the exact same thing as above. So there are two ways to do the exact same thing. And if this was a user, the user doesn't care that both arrays are the same. They don't care how they were constructed. But as a developer, that's our role to understand why declarative makes more sense. Think of it that way, a list of instructions to get to a specific address, whereas this would just be the address where we could type into a satellite navigation, for example, and it just simply tells us how to get there. But the key rule is here we're describing what, and here we're describing how. I just want you to map over my items and return me each item's name. Now, the great thing with this is we could, in fact, adopt a more functional style. We could, for example, change this over to item.price, and then we'd get an array of numbers. We could then, because map returns us a new array, we could pass in another function where we can have each individual price and then the next price. And then inside of here, we could say return the price plus the next price. And I've made a small typo by our function, so we'll just fix that up. We have our price plus next price. If we save this out, we then have 897, so they have been added together. Now this is called chaining, this technique where we are chaining the prototype methods. Each one, for example, returns a new array. So map is declaratively creating a new array for us under the hood, which we can see if we revert this back to just our name properties, we then get that array of names. But we can, of course, chain them like we're just demonstrating here. And already we're looking at a more functional style because these are pure functions, which we're going to learn about in the next video. So that's quite a nice introduction to declarative programming. Again, it's more of a mental model for us to describe what we want. It's more readable. I don't know about you, but I can see what, and I know what a map does. I can see that I get the item, and all I need to do is just return item.price. We can then chain if we want in. If we get a new array back like we do with the map, we can then reduce it. And then again, we get a final output of 897, for example. Now what I'll do instead of item names declarative, we'll just rename this to items total declarative because now we're doing something a little bit more advanced. We're using a functional approach, pure functions. We could actually do all this inside of reduce. However, that's for another day. And that also is covered in JavaScript Basics, also a course here on Ultimate Courses as part of the JavaScript bundle that we have. So that's it for this video. We've looked at our items array, the imperative, the list of instructions to the machine versus declaring exactly what we want. Two different styles. I think it's much more agreed that using a declarative approach is more favored nowadays, especially with libraries such as React.